Right now, without thinking about it, you're wearing clothes. You put them on this morning the same way you do every morning, automatically, without question, the way you breathe or blink. It's so normal it doesn't even register as a behavior anymore. But here's what's strange about that. Of the 8 million species on this planet, only one does it. Only one animal on Earth decided at some point in its history to cover itself. And the reason it did, the real reason, not the one you were taught, is far more interesting than staying warm. Because here's the thing about that explanation. Humans lived in Africa for the first 100,000 years of our existence. Sub-Saharan Africa, one of the hottest environments on the planet. And somewhere in that heat, before we ever saw snow, before we ever needed insulation from cold, we started wearing things on our bodies. The temperature explanation doesn't hold up. It never really did. So what actually happened? The oldest direct evidence of clothing doesn't come from fabric. Fabric decays. It disappears over thousands of years, leaving nothing behind. What researchers found instead was something much smaller and much stranger. Lice. In 2003, a team of researchers at the Max Planck Institute used genetic sequencing to study human body lice, the kind that live specifically in clothing, not on skin or in hair. Body lice are a different species from head lice. They evolved separately, and the only way a new louse species that lives exclusively in clothing could have evolved is if clothing existed for long enough to create a stable new habitat. So the researchers traced the genetic split between head lice and body lice backward through time, the same way you'd use a family tree to find a common ancestor. And what they found was that body lice diverged from head lice approximately 170,000 years ago. In Africa, long before any ice age, long before any cold that would have required insulation. Humans were already wearing something. But wearing what, and more importantly, why? The oldest actual clothing ever discovered comes from a cave in Morocco called Contrabandiers. In 2021, archaeologists published an analysis of bones found at the site dating back 120,000 years. The bones were from carnivores, bears, foxes, wolves, wildcats. And when researchers examined them under microscopes, they found something specific about the cut marks. The animals hadn't been butchered for meat. The cut marks were in entirely the wrong places for that. They were concentrated around the paws, the skull, and along the edges of the pelt. Exactly the places you'd cut if you were carefully removing a skin to wear it, not to eat the animal underneath. These were pelts, deliberately removed, deliberately processed 120,000 years ago in a climate that did not require them for warmth. Which brings us back to the same uncomfortable question. If not warmth, then what? The answer that keeps emerging from the research is one that's far more human than practical. Protection from the sun came first for some researchers. Early humans losing their body hair around 1.2 million years ago would have needed something to shield skin from UV radiation. But that still doesn't explain the deliberate, careful pelt removal in Morocco. Sun protection doesn't require a wolf skin. The explanation that fits the evidence most completely is this. The first clothing was not functional, it was communicative. Think about what clothing actually does beyond keeping you warm. It tells other people who you are. It signals your status, your group, your identity. It says something about you before you open your mouth. Every culture that has ever existed on Earth, every single one without exception, uses clothing to communicate social meaning. Not one human culture has ever been documented that treats clothing as purely practical. Anthropologists now believe this is exactly what happened 170,000 years ago. Early humans began wearing things not because they needed to, but because they had developed something that required expression, a sense of self, a social identity, a need to signal to other members of the group who they were and where they belonged. Clothing didn't follow civilization. It may have helped create it. Because here's what wearing something on your body requires before anything else. It requires you to think about how you appear to other people. It requires what psychologists call theory of mind, the ability to model what another person sees when they look at you, to understand that you exist as an object in someone else's perception. That is not a simple cognitive skill. Most animals don't have it. The ones that do, great apes, elephants, dolphins, corvids, are the same ones that pass the mirror test, recognizing themselves as a self rather than seeing a stranger. Clothing, as a behavior, only makes sense if the animal wearing it understands that it has an appearance that other members of its species perceive and respond to, which means the moment a human first put on a pelt, not for warmth, not for protection, but to wear it, was the moment they demonstrated one of the most sophisticated cognitive abilities in the natural world. By 40,000 years ago, there is evidence of bone needles, the oldest sewing tools ever found discovered in Siberia. Needles mean tailored clothing, fitted garments constructed to match the body wearing them. This is no longer a pelt thrown over a shoulder. This is intentional design, applied to the body as a surface. And by the time humans began spreading across the planet, into Europe, across Asia, eventually into the Americas, clothing went with them everywhere. Not as an afterthought, as one of the first things they built wherever they arrived. There is a site in the Czech Republic called Dolní Věstonice, occupied around 26,000 years ago. Archaeologists found impressions of woven textiles pressed into ancient clay, not clothing itself, but the ghost of it, preserved in fired earth. The textiles were fine, deliberately woven with technique, by people living through an ice age in shelters made of mammoth bones. These were not people thinking only about survival. These were people thinking about what they looked like. So here is what the evidence actually shows. Humans started wearing things 170,000 years ago in one of the warmest places on Earth. Not because they were cold, not because they needed protection from predators, but because they had developed a sense of self sophisticated enough to understand that how they appeared to others was something they could shape and control. Every piece of clothing ever made, from a wolf pelt in a Moroccan cave to whatever you're wearing right now, is an expression of the same impulse. The need to say something about who you are without speaking a word. You didn't just get dressed this morning. You did what humans have been doing for 170,000 years. You told the world something about yourself before it had a chance to ask.